didn't it seem like just a week ago or so, we were fighting about whether or not the economy should reopen and whether or not the reopen protesters are evil or if people who don't want to wear masks just want to kill grandma. I swear, like, people, if you don't understand what principles you stand for, you will be in a constant state of flux around different issues that the media tells you are important. It's like the coronavirus gone. As far as I'm concerned, the lockdowns are over because people are out protesting. They're not socially distancing at all. Most of them are not wearing masks. If they are wearing masks, it's because they're trying to protect their identities because they're looting. We've completely forgotten that the Surgeon General issued a warning saying people who wear masks are actually more likely to get infected because what they do is they ignore other protocols like social distancing because the mask acts like a security blanket. I can tell you, like, for weeks, from people I knew, because I said I don't want masks to be mandated, I was told, you just want a haircut, you just want to kill grandma, you're a horrible person, don't you ever want the virus to go away? For weeks, I heard this, now it's gone. It's gone. Has anyone said anything about the protesters and the rioters and the looters in the last week? No, gone. Because it's allowed. And this is like perfectly depicted with this cartoon that I found on Reddit. Life in Minneapolis. On one side, you've got a man who has a small business that is protesting to let him reopen his business, and he's being labeled as a dangerous white nationalist, even if he's black, white nationalist terrorist lunatic by the media and the leftists. And on the other end, you have someone who's breaking into his store to steal a TV, who we are calling a righteous protester, and we have no problem with it at all. Have we lost our goddamn minds? I'm sorry. Like, listen, man. Listen. Doesn't what's gone on in the world in the last week make it seem like all of the nonsense around the reopen protest is like small potatoes? And you know, I tend to agree with that to a certain extent. I mean, it like the issues we're dealing with now are much bigger and much more, dare I say, problematic than the reopen protest. But as someone who followed the reopen protest and support the reopen protest and, you know, interviewed some of those guys in Michigan that were really just trying to stand up for their rights and civil liberties and then were smeared in national media as being white supremacists and Nazis and just all around horrible people because they wanted to be able to reopen their businesses, to watch what's happening now, it pisses me off. The hypocrisy, the raging hypocrisy of it all really, really pisses me off. And it's something that, to me, this is just so obvious. The absolute double standard where protesting is not okay when it's coming from the right and people are talking about civil liberties, but of course it's okay when people are rioting and looting and burning down cities. Now, I want to just really emphasize, I think that what happened to George Floyd is a tragedy. It was a murder. It was a murder. It is a horrible thing. I hope all of those cops involved are prosecuted and go to prison for a really long time. That's my position on it. If I was in Minneapolis, I would absolutely be protesting that because I don't believe there's anything wrong with a peaceful protest. There's nothing wrong with it. It is part of our First Amendment rights. It is constitutionally protected to go outside and peacefully protest. I would be right there along with them. But there was nothing wrong when the reopen people did it either. There was nothing wrong when they protested. And frankly, the reopen protests were actually a lot safer than what we've been seeing over the last week, because in the reopen protests, a lot of them were doing it with cars. They were in cars, they were socially distancing, a lot of them were wearing masks, they were coordinating everything in the police. The American Patriot Rally in Michigan, they coordinated everything with law enforcement. It was very peaceful. It was very orderly. And they're the dangerous terrorists that Hillary Clinton is tweeting about, but the people now that are literally burning down cities. When I saw the footage of Washington, D.C. last night, oh my God. I literally teared up. It's awful what's happening. It's awful. And, you know, on the left, it's completely okay. You know, they're just angry. They're just blowing off steam, burning down cities. Are you kidding me? And I think I'm not the only one who's starting to complain about this. And listen, again, I want to emphasize, this is a small potatoes thing to complain about, but hypocrisy in any form really pisses me off. So we're going to read this opinion piece from Reason.com. Protesting police violence is critical. But why are the social distance shamers suddenly so quiet? What happened to staying at home to keep grandparents safe no matter what? I think that's a very good question. But before we dig into this article, I'm going to do a shameless self-promotion on my channel. Listen, folks, if you like the content I'm making, please make sure you subscribe, turn on those notifications, give it a thumbs up. If you think you're subscribed, just double check for me. And if you want to go the extra mile and support me with donations or things like that, there's all sorts of info in the description below. You can join my locals community where you can get all of this content ad-free. I upload all my videos to locals so you don't have to deal with those annoying Facebook ads. You can also donate via PayPal and via Subscribestar. And I greatly, greatly, greatly appreciate the support. I'm very grateful. It allows me to free up my time to create more content and even hopefully make it better. My husband's always trying to help me make it better. Sometimes I listen to him. So I hope that you'll continue to support me. Please and thank you. All right, let's dig into this article. The protesters taking to the streets to demand justice for the killing of George Floyd certainly have a righteous case. They are, breaking just about every rule of social distancing. And many of the most committed voices in support of continuing the aggressive, painful measures to contain the spread of coronavirus suddenly have nothing to say about it. And that's my biggest complaint, is just like the raging hypocrisy. Listen, if you were speaking out against the reopen protesters and speaking out in the same exact way against the protesters that are protesting George Floyd's killing, then I'd have no beef. You and I would have no beef because you're consistent in your values. You are consistent in what you stand for. I was in favor of people exercising their First Amendment rights for the reopen protests. I'm in favor of people exercising those rights if they're peacefully protesting, not rioting, not looting, not burning stuff down. If they're peacefully protesting, 100% in favor of it. And I don't have to agree, and I do happen to agree with the protests for George Floyd's killing, but that's almost beside the point. I don't actually have to agree with what you're protesting to support your right to protest. Listen, man, you know what you do? If you don't want to support someone's right to protest, if you don't agree with the reason that someone is protesting, you know what you do? You don't go to the protest. It's really that simple. When the Women's March was happening in DC, I didn't really agree with it. I thought it was kind of stupid. I didn't go. I watched it on the news. I kept up with what was happening. I completely support their right to do it, but I just didn't go. That is the answer. If you don't agree with the protest, don't go. But don't complain about it when someone is protesting about something that you don't agree with and then say nothing when you do. That's not a principled position. A month ago, when Georgia Governor Brian Kemp ended the state's COVID-19 lockdown and allowed gyms, restaurants, and nail salons and other businesses to reopen, many in the mainstream media accused him of wanton disregard for human life. The Atlantic described the state's relaxation of the very strict social distancing measures as Georgia's experiment in human sacrifice. Can you imagine that? No one died in the reopen protests. No one died. People are literally dying with what's going on right now. Literally. When Florida beaches reopened, it was the same story. CNN highlighted the activism of a local man who had dressed as the Grim Reaper and warning sunbathers that people would die unless they went home. Referencing the stereotype of the Florida man as a reckless and moronic thrill seeker, the Washington Post wrote that Governor Ron DeSantis was essentially standing astride the alligator cage, hollering at the rest of the country to check out what's about to happen. Photos and videos of people gathering in the parks in New York City, beaches in California, and public places elsewhere have generated thunderous denunciation on social media for the past few weeks. Shaming people for failing to socially distance is now commonplace for health authorities, government officials, amateur social media sleuths, and of course many journalists in the mainstream press. There have also been some welcome pushback. You remember when the state of California spent money pouring sand into skate parks because they didn't want skateboarders to use those skate parks? But are they doing anything now? No, I mean the cops are out in California. That's pretty clear. But they're not. It's not even remotely the same pushback. There were police officers chasing people who were jogging by themselves on the beach. Are you kidding me? The responses to these two things have been completely disproportional, and I just don't understand the logic. Well, of course I understand the logic. One is responding to the right, and the other is responding to the left. It is no accident that the term Karen, a divisive nickname for the type of snitch who summons the authorities to intervene in trivial matters, well done, Reason.com, has suddenly become culturally ubiquitous. Karens are calling out social distancing fails on social media. Karens are on cable news scolding the unmasked. Karens are giving press conferences threatening those who violate stay-at-home orders with arrest. What happened to that, by the way? What happened with people being arrested who violated stay-at-home orders? Seems to have disappeared. It's hard to imagine how that can continue. Exactly. Lockdown over. In their formal statements, a lot of public officials are correctly endorsing the protesters' concerns about police violence, and many have condemned the street violence that occurred during these protests. But what we are not seeing is widespread condemnation of the protesters on what might have been the most obvious point of criticism. They are manifestly violating the social distancing orders. Again, if we are to believe that earlier dire warnings from the public health officials about what would happen if the lockdowns were relaxed too quickly, people who fail to practice aggressive social distancing will spread the disease and get others killed. By the logic of lockdown supporters, even the protesters who are practicing strict nonviolence have a lot of blood on their hands. Isn't that ironic? It's like a dilemma. Right? It's like a dilemma. Like which way do you want to go with this? Do you still want to rag on people for not wearing masks? Or do you want to support the protesters and the rioters and the looters and pretend they're not Antifa when they are? Like which do you want to choose? I mean, it's an interesting dilemma for the people on the left. But luckily for people like me, and I hope you, who actually take principled stances on things, we take those stances when they're convenient and we take those stances when they're inconvenient, we can at least have something to push back now to say, remember that time when there was literal rioting in the streets and you said nothing about killing grandma? And make no mistake, the protests unfolding all over the country are violating quarantine in a number of ways. Remember that many places are still under stay-at-home orders, and people are only supposed to go outside for essential work or allowable recreation in small numbers. Does protesting constitute essential work now? Or allowable recreation? They're definitely not keeping to groups under 10, are they? On the plus side, some protesters are thankfully wearing masks. Thankfully. They're so, listen, man, masks are only effective when you're also social, Jesus, this is not gonna actually protect people. If you're right next to someone and they're getting, their sweat, all over you and they're fiddling with their mask, do you really think the masks are gonna protect you? I don't. That's stupid. But the sheer number of people involved, packed together tightly, often engaging in high-spread activities like yelling, certainly override much of the benefit. Even Denver protesters, who comparatively restrained demonstration involved gathering in a public place and lying prone on the ground for 8 minutes, the amount of time George Floyd's alleged killer had a knee on Floyd's neck, shouted, "I can't breathe," the entire time. Holding police accountable is a very important cause, but the logic of the lockdowns was that they are so necessary to stem the spread of COVID-19 that they should override other pressing concerns. Small business owners were forced to shutter, and many will close permanently. Over 100,000 small businesses have closed permanently as a regards of all this. Many will close permanently because policymakers ordained that slowing the pandemic was the top priority. Daring to reopen was an experiment in human sacrifice, a dangerous practice akin to riding an alligator while yelling "Yee-haw!" California Governor Gavin Newsom, who had fought to prevent churches from reopening to the public, characteristically said the protesters were rightfully outraged. That's another thing. People aren't able to practice their religion freely. In New Hampshire, Chris Sununu said, Trump doesn't make the decision about when the church is open. I make the decision about when the church is open. People aren't, and listen, I'm not a Christian. I don't go to church, but I will dang sure defend everyone's right to practice their faith in whatever way they deem fit, as long as they're not hurting other people. That's really the only qualification I put on it, not hurting other people. And no, I don't think that potentially getting a virus that most people are not going to die from counts enough to restrict someone's ability to practice their First Amendment rights and exercise their religious choice. I just don't think so. He did not scold them to go back inside before they get their grandparents killed. Media and government experts who fail to consistently call out social distancing violations risk giving the impression that their commitment to zealous enforcement of public health measures wasn't as absolute as they claimed. You think? It turns out they are willing to make exceptions for their preferred cases. Perhaps those who previously went overboard on social distancing shaming should admit that this was a mistake. The current silence of the Karens is deafening. I agree, man. I agree. And this shows you, like, the people who spoke up during this shows you who is taking a principled stance and who is not taking a principled stance. Because if they were not taking a principled stance in favor of the reopen protesters and their First Amendment rights, when most of those reopen protests happened very, very irresponsibly, of course there were irresponsible people at it. There's always, at a protest, there are always irresponsible people. Of course there were, but a lot of them were behaving very very responsibly. They're socially distancing. A lot of them were wearing masks. A lot of them were doing it from their cars. We don't even see those people a lot of the times because the media doesn't cover it, but a lot of people were protesting from their cars specifically to socially distance. Those people are terrorists, but yet the people looting and rioting and burning down cities are not, and you say nothing. That's blatant hypocrisy. If you have people in your life that were speaking up and saying they just want to kill grandma and get a haircut, and they're saying nothing now, those are your hypocrites, my friend. Those are your hypocrites. They are not to be trusted. Do not take their opinion on anything because they will change on a dime based on what's politically convenient.